Today, we're going to talk about a specific and really well-documented story that happened right here in Canada. And it's one of those stories that forces us to ask a pretty tough question. And this right here is the heart of the matter. It's a question that came out of a really dark chapter of medical history, but one that, you'll see, is still incredibly relevant today. So let's get into it. To really understand how something like this could even happen, we need to rewind a bit. We've got to go back to the mid-20th century and just take a look at what psychiatric care in Canada was like back then. In almost every province, there were these huge institutions that operated under really strict systems. People who were patients there were often completely dependent on that system for everything. And it was this environment, this kind of isolation and dependency that really set the stage for one of Canada's most disturbing medical stories. Okay, so that's the general picture. Now let's zoom in on one specific city, Montreal, and a program that you might have heard of before, MKUltra. So MKUltra, it sounds like something out of a spy movie, but it wasn't a conspiracy theory. This was a real, secret CIA program that was eventually acknowledged in U.S. Senate hearings. The goal was pretty chilling: find ways to control the human mind. And while a lot of this was happening in the States, research money also made its way up here to Canada. And here is the crucial link. One of these MKUltra projects was based at a psychiatric clinic in Montreal, led by a very well-respected psychiatrist, Dr. D. Ewan Cameron. He got funding from what looked like a normal scientific foundation, but it was only years later that it was revealed that this foundation was actually a front secretly funneling money from the CIA for this research. Now, on paper, this was all framed as research into new treatments for things like anxiety and depression. But in reality, the methods that were developed and used on patients, well, they went far, far beyond anything we would recognize as therapy. So this slide breaks down the two main techniques they were using. First, there was something called depatterning. The idea was to literally shatter a person's existing personality using drug-induced comas, very high-voltage electroshocks, and messing with their sleep. The goal was to wipe the slate clean. And then came step 2, psychic driving. Patients in this incredibly weakened state were then forced to listen to looped audio messages, just the same phrases over and over for days on end, often while totally cut off from their senses. Let's try to see this from a patient's point of view, based on what we know from their testimonies. So imagine you're seeking help for depression. You meet with a doctor, an authority figure, who makes a promise. They tell you the clinic has these advanced methods, that they can help you. And like most of us would, you trust them. You sign the forms. But here's the thing. No one ever really explains what this treatment is actually going to be, not in plain language. So you're not giving real informed consent. And all the while, your family is kind of kept at arm's length. They're just given these vague assurances that, the process is difficult, but it's necessary for recovery. And this is the devastating results. The person who left the hospital wasn't healed. They were, in their own words, a totally different person, broken, with huge chunks of their memory just gone. Some couldn't recognize their own family. Their lives, their relationships were just permanently damaged. So decades go by. The truth starts to slowly come out, and the focus finally shifts to accountability. Who was actually responsible for what happened here? Well, it turned out that it wasn't just the CIA's money. Dr. Cameron's research had also been funded by grants from Canadian federal departments. And that raised a huge new question. What did the Canadian government know? And what was its responsibility? To try and find an answer, the government commissioned a legal opinion. And just take a look at this timeline. The experiments are happening in the 50s and 60s. But it isn't until 1986, we're talking decades later, that the Canadian government finally releases its official report on the whole thing. This report, known as the Cooper Report, was presented as an independent legal opinion. Its official job was to figure out the government's role and its legal liability. But for the survivors, it just became this symbol of how a system can protect itself. In fact, many critics just call it a whitewash, an investigation designed to cover things up, not expose them. And the difference between the official report and what the survivors actually went through is, well, it's staggering. The report uses this very careful legalistic language. It talks about limited harm and narrow liability. It's focused on whether the grant money was structured correctly. But the survivors, they're telling a story of ruined lives, of families torn apart, and this just deep sense of betrayal. Their question isn't about paperwork, it's who let this happen to me? Now, it's tempting to look at all this as just a tragic story from a different time. But the patterns that were revealed here, they're timeless. And that's why this piece of history matters so much right now.
This story really shows a dangerous combination of three key elements. First, you have a closed system hidden away from public view. Second, you have vulnerable people who are completely dependent on that system. And finally, when it all goes wrong, you have a power structure that gets to investigate itself.
So first, the harm happens. Then, decades later, you get the lawsuits and the reports. And on paper, the whole thing ends with these official apologies and promises that lessons have been learned. But that kind of language, it often provides a sense of closure for the institution, not for the people who were actually hurt. The blame gets carefully narrowed down, and real accountability just seems to slip away. And this leaves us with a final and, I think, a vital question for today. When we hear about an independent review in any system that's supposed to serve vulnerable people, whether it's mental health, disability support, or long-term care, what have we really learned from this story? Is that review truly designed to find the truth and protect people, or is its primary purpose, once again, to protect the system itself?